Hey everybody, welcome back to Record-ology. This is gonna be fun. So you've got some Christmas money, perhaps, maybe some chore money. Your Aunt Matilda gave you a nice little $5 check. It's amazing how they do that. Inflation just doesn't seem to, register with family members sometimes. But it was a kind gift. You add it to your savings and you've got enough to go buy a record player, at least you hope so. But how do you know you're getting a good record player, especially if you are shopping for one at a thrift store, an antique store, or even more so if you're meeting up with somebody on Craigslist? Be careful about that, or Facebook. How do you know that the turntable you're getting is worth your time and money? I'm going to show you exactly how to spot a bad turntable. You're not going to want to miss this. So in that moment, you are meeting with somebody to buy a turntable. You are at a thrift store, an antique store, and you're looking at this and you're just so excited. Calm down, take a deep breath, and do not let the excitement of that moment cloud your judgment, because this is your time, this is your moment to really see if this turntable is worth what you're talking about investing in it. And I'm not going to talk about price today, and everything we're going to do today in terms of inspecting turntables that we're considering buying is going to be done with our bare hands. No tools required, none of that stuff. So how do I know if I'm about to buy a bad record player, a bad turntable?
Everything on this channel is junk. Well, if it's Crosley, it's crap. Nothing makes me happy anymore, especially crap record players. Do Crosleys destroy your records? It don't cost $40,000. It ain't worth it.
No, that's absolutely not true. Okay, so we got that out of the way. You can forego those comments, and let's jump into some real world tips and tricks. So if the record player you're considering looks like this, it's a Suitcase player, or if it's a wooden all-in-one unit, I want you to know that these units will never sound as good as higher end units, and that's why they cost less. So if you are aware of that and you're okay with that, then feel free to proceed. But here is what you want to be looking for. You want to be looking for this cartridge right here. If it has this cartridge, I'm going to zoom in so you can be sure to get a good look at it. And again, I'm not going to go into the details on why right now, but if you see this cartridge, that means it's a ceramic type, and just know that it will never sound as good as a cartridge found on a higher end unit. Many of these units have connections on the back where you can hook it up to a bigger stereo system or speakers, powered speakers, and make it sound better, but just know that this is not the best sounding type of record player. If you're okay with that, you understand that, then here's what I would look for. The first thing is these suffer from a sound quality issue just above and beyond the technology limitations of the cartridge, in that there is an impedance mismatch that often happens with this type of cartridge on these types of record players, and you can't really tell by looking at it if yours is going to be affected. Now, you don't need to know what an impedance mismatch is other than to know it's going to make it sound tinny, no bass, kind of shrill and extra harsh. So if you don't want those sound characteristics, pay attention to this. Most of these made in the last 3 or 4 years don't suffer from this problem, at least not as many of them do as the older units. A lot of record players will often have a sticker underneath that shows when it was made. And the reason why this is important is if it's an older unit, if it's a Suitcase player or an all-in-one unit prior to like 2017, 2018, it's a higher likelihood that it will be impedance mismatched and the sound won't be as good. If it doesn't have an out-and-out date sticker on it, you can oftentimes look at the serial number, and on this one we can see that it was made in June of 2021. Therefore, it's more recent and the impedance match should be done properly. That's the number one thing you want to check. Number two, make sure that it's complete. So we see the 45 adapter is just loose. And again, if it doesn't have a 45 adapter, you can find those online. They're not hard to find. But if you want it complete, take time to glance over there, make sure that's complete. Also, it doesn't hurt to kind of gently grasp the back of the tone arm, the counterweight area or spring, that's this piece. Give it a gentle wiggle. And see how it's got a little bit of movement? That's fine. If it's got excessive looseness and it just feels cheap and like it's about to fall apart, that would be a red flag. Make sure that, it does have the red stylus housing on there and that the needle is present and not snapped off. It is fairly common that people will snap off the needle or the belt, which we'll get to in a minute, on these and think, oh, it's broken, and they'll toss it, which can be a good opportunity for you, but just know that you would need to buy a replacement stylus, which is less than $5, and in order to get this thing running. So make sure that it does have the cantilever, which is the little shaft sticking down there, and the needle underneath that. And it's okay to gently take your finger and just kind of touch it gently to make sure that the needle is there as well. No big deal whatsoever. You can also take the platter and give it a little bit of a spin, especially looking from the side to make sure that there's not too much platter wobble. This one looks pretty reasonable. You want to make sure it's not wobbling too much. And then looking even closer right in here, we can see that the belt is present and that it is installed. If you look under here and see that there's no belt, again, not necessarily a huge deal breaker depending on the price, but just be aware you're going to have to invest in a belt. The platter comes off. You just have to remove this little clip that's right here. And on mine, it's not present because I've removed it and probably lost it, which happens. But just be aware that if the belt isn't present, you will need to buy one. You start to see why it's good to know these things going into it, because you get so hyped up, you don't even think to look at half this stuff. You can unclip it and just kind of move the tone arm, make sure that it moves freely, that there's no major issues with it. Because oftentimes you don't have the flexibility to power it up and test it in a store, or especially if you're meeting somebody to buy something used. So take them at their word to a certain degree, but you have to be vigilant, and you don't necessarily need to test out every function, but does it work? Are there any issues? Most people are going to be honest, but at the same time, you want to be vigilant and know what to look for. So you're not going to have the opportunity to test out every single function and feature of the record player. But then again, if it's used, you should be getting a heck of a good price. So that's what I would recommend when it comes to the Suitcase players and the wooden all-in-one units. But what about if we take it a step up? Okay, so let's say you want to take it to the next level, but you want to do it in a way that's not going to break the bank. And you see something like this at Goodwill, and you're like, man, that's a good price. And it looks like it's a fancier record player. It's bigger. And, how do I know if this is worth it? How do I know that this is a good deal? Similar principles for what we looked at earlier, a couple extra things. If it's supposed to have a dust cover, make sure it does. So if you see the clips in the back and there's no dust cover, just be aware that that's missing. That happens sometimes. This one is very scuffed up, so be aware that that happens as well. It's not much you can either decide to pass on it because of that or keep it because of that. Again, it's really up to you. You can find replacements, but if it's supposed to have a dust cover and it's missing, you should know that up front. You should know what to look for. A lot of the same stuff applies. Make sure that it's got its power supply. Some sort of power supply is better than none. However, if you have time to make sure it's properly matched, the brand on the power supply will most likely not match the brand of the unit. And that's another tip I want to kind of give you out the gate, is to realize that brand names these days really don't matter. From brands that you think would be good, like Sony, and even higher end brands in the turntable space, you can get junky turntables. And conversely, brands that you've never heard of, or even brands that don't have the greatest reputation, can sometimes have fantastic turntables. So I would recommend that you kind of ignore branding and brand names, because usually they're made by third-party companies anyway. Very uncommon for a company to make their own turntable or any electronics these days. But back to my point, don't worry that the power supply is made by a different company than the brand name on the turntable. If you have time, and oftentimes if you're standing in a store or you're doing a Craigslist deal, you don't. But if you have time, you could match the input and output, or specifically the output of the power supply, to make sure it's proper for the unit. But usually it is. Things like platter mats are easily replaceable, but if you see it, sitting off to the side, don't worry about that. You can just put it right back on. Sometimes you'll see the belt sticking out, and that's fine too. I've picked up great turntables before that people have donated to secondhand shops like Goodwill and other places, because the belt came off and they don't want to deal with it, or they don't know how. Whereas we can fix it in 2 minutes with a flathead screwdriver, take the platter off, put the belt back on, and you're in business. Same thing with the needle, the cartridge. You can put a stylus replacement on in 2 minutes. Now, you may need to order parts if the belt's broken or the stylus is broken, but it's doable. So figure that into things. But if you want it to work today with no effort, make sure your belt's on and present. Make sure your cartridge is there with a needle and nothing is busted off. If you come across a turntable that has this cartridge with the silver body and the white housing for the stylus, this is the next level up. This is a much higher quality sounding cartridge This will yield a much higher definition stereo sound. So this is a good thing to look for if you really want to make sure your record player has good sound. Okay, so what about if you're spending a little bit of money? The turntables we just looked at are all going to be less than 50 bucks, hopefully well less than $50 on the used market. But what if you're spending, you know, 200, 300 or even $400 on a higher end turntable? Well, first of all, you're probably not going to find those in antique stores or in thrift stores. Those are mostly going to be in a person-to-person interaction, like a Craigslist dealing, a Facebook dealing. Again, be very cautious, be very vigilant. Let somebody know where you're going to be. Keep your phone with you. Those can be very dangerous, unfortunately. But if you choose to engage in that sort of purchasing, you can get good deals. This is a $500 Fluence RT85N, and this would be something that may pop up on the market for, $400, maybe even $350 used. So it may be an opportunity for you to step up your turntable game, for a decent price, albeit a bit more expensive. Okay, a lot of the same principles apply. Make sure that the power supply is present. Make sure that the belt is present and intact. On this one, it's a lot easier because it's an external belt. It's also a good idea to give it a spin, not just for the platter wobble, but also to see how loose that main bearing is. If I take the belt off completely, and again, if you're spending at this level, the person shouldn't mind you, spending a moment to test things out. And give it a little spin. If it spins freely, especially the longer the better, then that means that bearing is well lubricated and it's a good one. It's not dried out. When you're dealing with vintage turntables, a lot of times the old grease can harden and dry. And if you go to spin the platter and nothing, it just goes for a second and then stops, then it's going to need lubrication, which isn't the end of the world, but just be aware that that's something you're going to need to take into consideration. If it doesn't have the belt, be aware that that's going to be an investment. Same thing with a power supply. Another thing that happens from time to time is cartridges and head shells get left off with just these tone arms. And obviously you can't play records today on this if you don't have a head shell. So make sure that it has the head shell. It's really nice, these removable head shells, because you can take a quick and easy look, make sure the cantilever's there. You can gently feel the stylus to make sure that it's present. It is always recommended when you buy a used record player that you immediately replace the needle, the stylus right away. Just order a new one. However, at your discretion, you can choose to use the one that's on there. I do that from time to time. Go ahead and gently wiggle the gimbal. It should be pretty much rock steady, especially at this price point. Make sure the counterbalance is present. Just make sure everything is complete. Just take a second to look. Make sure the clip is there. Make sure the lift lever is there. To make sure all the knobs are there. Make sure it's complete. When you're buying something at this level, the seller should have a little bit more patience and not want to just immediately, throw it into your lap and drive off. If they do, then that's kind of a warning sign. But at the same time, I get it. You don't want to sit there for an eternity, and neither does that person wanting to talk about this thing. They want to make the transaction. So you got to be speedy to a degree, but you also want to know what to look for. Obviously, ask them, does this thing have any problems? Is there anything they should be aware of? Most people are honest and they'll happily share that information. And if it does have an issue, you can use that as a negotiation point and say, well, since it is missing the belt, how about I give you $50 less, and that way I can go get a belt or something like that. Most people will be very reasonable, and that's just, again, a little advice that I would give to you. But if you have an opportunity to demo the system and you choose to do it, I personally don't like that. If somebody's like, well, come over to my house, I'll demo it for you. I don't do that. I personally don't feel comfortable going into somebody's house unless I know them. So I'm not going to go in there and let them, hook it up and demo it. If you know the person, you trust the person, then you would have the opportunity to really give it a listen. And when people are selling super hi-fi stuff like thousands of dollars, I get where they would want to do that. But even at this price point, there's a bit of a gamble involved. So it's important to know what to look for before you take it home and test it out. Okay, if you're buying a vintage phonograph like this 1917 Vita Nola here, and I haven't talked about price in this video, but I have to mention it here. Don't pay more than $250, $300 at the max for any wind-up phonograph. That's my personal opinion. Now, I know there's collector's items that can garner a lot more money than that, but for the most part, these things were made by the millions, and they're not rare. Even though you might think they're rare, they may seem exotic and highly sought after, but there's just so many of them out there. They often sell for $75 to $150 in working condition, even if they're Victrola branded or Edison branded. Just want to keep that in mind. So don't spend more than, I would say the sweet spot's $150 to $250 on these, and no more than $300. If you choose to buy one of these, a few things to look for: the crank. Make sure the crank is present. If you look onto the side of this and you see this hole where the crank is supposed to go, then that's a red flag. Also, give it a little bit of a spin. You should feel tension. If it's completely loose, that could indicate the mainspring is broken. These are basically enormous watches with wound springs inside. There's a whole motor assembly. We've looked at that in the past. You're not going to have time necessarily to check that out in the moment. Hopefully you do, but you may not. So just be aware that there should be some tension there. And obviously ask the person, does this thing work? Is it just an empty shell? Does it just look like a vintage unit, or is it really a vintage unit? The front grille easily comes out. This one just lift up and remove it. You can see the horn. Make sure that it's present. Make sure that it's not broken. All that good stuff. There's not much else you can do. This is completely acoustic, so there's no power supply, no cords or anything like that. This is kind of tricky to get back. Okay, there we go. And obviously you want to make sure that it's a real phonograph unit. When you lift the lid, are the guts in there? And that may sound silly, but it happens. People gut these things or put cheap or modern record players in them. So by looking at the outside is not enough to say, yes, this is a phonograph instead of just a piece of furniture at this point. So lift the lid, look under there, make sure that it's got the appropriate parts that it's supposed to have, unless you just want a really cool looking wine cabinet. And in that case, this thing should be $25 and not even $75. Okay, the first thing is to make sure that this armature right here is intact. Check the movement of it. It's okay that it squeaks a little bit. You can always lubricate it. But these are oftentimes made out of nickel plating, and they can crumble. They can fall apart. In fact, mine is starting to have some deterioration back here. But make sure there's not gaping holes in it, that it's not frozen in any certain position. It should be able to rotate across and, have all the normal movements. The other thing is this piece right here. This is called a reproducer. That is a disc of mica. And essentially the needle is in contact with that disc of mica and vibrates it to reproduce the sound. Make sure that the white ring around the mica diaphragm, that's the gasket, is intact, because that needs to be sealed. So make sure that that's intact. Make sure that the mica itself is not cracked, broken, or missing. Otherwise, it will not work properly. Again, these can be rebuilt, but they get expensive. The next thing is this guy down here. This is the brake release. And you'll notice on mine that if I put the brake on, it still spins. That's because my brake is worn out. All the brake is on this thing is a pad of leather pressing on the inside of the platter. So when I push it like this, it's worn out. It's not enough friction to stop it. It has a tendency to go loose. So you can see that this motor is wound, and if I just put the brake on, it doesn't instantly stop it. You kind of have to press firmly and then stop it, and then be patient. I usually leave the motor in an unwound state. This is a speed regulator. If you have this thing spinning and you move that back and forth gently, you should be able to see the speed change. That's how you adjust to different speeds, because these things, from a speed consistency standpoint, are all over the board. Everywhere from 78 to 80, and some discs up to 120 RPM, although they wouldn't fit on this anyway. But just a couple of things to be on the lookout for. And things like the finish is probably the easiest thing to deal with. You can get furniture polish and clean these up. Be aware of the condition of this green felt pad. This essentially it's a slip mat or a platter mat, and it's oftentimes glued to the steel or aluminum platter itself. Make sure you've got needles. These require a new needle after every single play officially, although there are needles that can be played multiple times. And that's a very, very, much a point of contention in the record world, the antique world. But officially, every single record side gets a fresh needle. So make sure that that's in place. You wouldn't want to put this down without a needle. And obviously, hopefully this goes without saying, don't play your vinyl records on this. This is only for shellac records. A needle like this will actually shred your vinyl records. This is a record destroyer if you put a vinyl record on here. This thing tracks at about 170 grams. 170 grams. To put that into some perspective, the dreaded Crosley Cruiser, and I'm rolling my eyes because it shouldn't be dreaded. It's a great unit. We looked at one earlier. That thing only tracks at 5 grams. So you tell me, what's more of a vinyl destroyer, the 5 grams or the 170? So just be vigilant. Hopefully that's common sense, but you never know. Now, people often ask, what about vintage but non-antique units? It's the same thing. Power supply, platter wobble. The added thing for vintage but not antique units, I'm talking like 60s, mostly 70s and 80s tech at this point, is be on the lookout for grease and lubrication issues. The grease will dry up and sometimes it will actually impede movement. So instead of allowing the dissipation of friction and the free and easy movement of parts, it can actually impede and get sticky. So be aware, check all the things that move, spin, rotate, pivot, make sure that they move freely. Also be aware that if you start looking at mid 80s and older, you can be dealing with bad capacitors. So there's a possibility everything else would be fine. You plug it in, there's no sound, or it's very low volume, or things aren't working and you're needing to, desolder capacitors and put on new ones. It happens. So be aware of that. All right, my friends, and that's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching. Final video of the year. 2022 has been a blast, and 2023 is looking even better. We've got some great surprises coming your way, so make sure you're subscribed. Select the bell notification, select all that good stuff so you don't miss our giveaways, our live shows, all that awesome entertainment coming your way. It's going to be a fun year. We've got some great stuff in store. Give a thumbs up to this video if you wouldn't mind, and let me know down in the comments below if you've got any additional tips or tricks for people out there shopping for a turntable, especially the first one. Well, my friends, that's going to do it for today. So happy record hunting, and we'll see you next time.